The noon sun beat down mercilessly on Coyote Bend, painting the dusty streets in shades of burnt amber and rust. Red dust swirled in lazy devils, coating everything it touched: the weathered storefronts, the hitching posts, the faces of townsfolk who'd gathered to witness something they couldn't quite comprehend. Eliza Hart moved through the crowd like a woman possessed, her calico dress heavy with sweat and dirt, the hem torn where she'd caught it on desert thorns. On her back, secured by makeshift leather straps fashioned from her own horse's reins, hung the unconscious form of a man. His fine leather coat, now dark with blood, marked him as someone of means, a stark contrast to the widow's worn attire. The whispers started before she'd taken 10 steps down Main Street. "Indian lover," someone hissed from beneath the awning of Murphy's General Store. "Shameless woman," came another voice, sharp as a scorpion's sting. A few men shifted their hands toward their holsters, the metal of their guns glinting like promises of violence in the harsh light. Deputy Daniel Reyes pushed through the gathering crowd, his badge catching the sun in brief, blinding flashes. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to choose his words as carefully as he chose his battles. "Put him down, Mrs. Hart. The militia's coming. I don't know how much longer I can protect you." Eliza tightened the straps across her shoulders, the movement revealing arms made strong by years of working her small homestead alone. The calluses on her hands spoke of endless days tending crops, mending fences, surviving in a land that showed no mercy to the weak. "I don't need your protection, deputy," she said, her voice steady despite the weight threatening to buckle her knees. "I just need to keep a man from dying like a dog in the street." The unconscious man stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. Eliza whispered something, words of comfort, or perhaps a prayer, and his eyes fluttered open. Recognition dawned in those fever-bright eyes as he focused on her face. "The meeting," Luke Calder rasped, his voice barely audible above the restless murmur of the crowd. "They ambushed, tried to stop." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he scanned the faces around them. He'd seen crowds like this before, seen how quickly curiosity could turn to bloodlust, how easily fear could transform neighbors into strangers, strangers into enemies. The deputy was caught between his duty to the law and something deeper, a pull toward justice that didn't always align with what was written in the statute books. "This man," Eliza announced, her voice carrying despite its quietness, "is Luke Calder, son of Amos Calder. He was trying to prevent an attack on the Apache storage houses when someone shot him in the back, someone who didn't want peace." The crowd erupted. Some shouted for both of them to be bound and dragged to the jail. Others pressed closer, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous anger that had started more than one lynching in towns like this. From the east end of town came a telltale dust cloud, riders approaching fast. Daniel glanced toward the narrow alley behind the jailhouse, calculating distances and chances. The heat clawed at his throat, making each breath feel like swallowing sand. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, more ominous. Eliza bent lower under her burden, adjusting her stance to better distribute Luke's weight. The words that came next were both command and supplication, carved from some deep place where courage meets desperation. "Lean on me," urged the widow, bearing the rancher's son on her back. The simplicity of it, the raw humanity in her gestures, seemed to freeze the moment in time. Here was a woman who'd buried her husband, who'd faced the contempt of a town that barely tolerated her presence, choosing to risk everything for a man whose father owned half the valley. Daniel made his decision in the space between heartbeats. "This way," he said quietly, moving toward the alley. "We'll take the back way, get horses and supplies. If we stay here, the only thing waiting is a rope." Eliza nodded, her jaws set with the kind of determination that had seen her through drought and loss and loneliness. Together, the unlikely trio slipped away from the growing mob, their shadows merging with those cast by the sun-baked adobe walls. Behind them, Coyote Bend seethed like a pot about to boil over. Someone fired a shot into the air, whether in celebration or warning. It was impossible to tell. The sound echoed off the buildings, a harsh punctuation to their escape. As they reached the relative safety of the alley, Eliza stumbled slightly, her strength finally showing its limits. Daniel reached out to steady her, his hand briefly touching her elbow. She pulled away. Not from pride, but from necessity. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. "Why?" Daniel asked as they paused in the shadow of the jail's back wall. "Why risk this for him?" Eliza's eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, met his. "Because when my Thomas was dying, burning up with fever, not one soul in this town would help. They were afraid of catching it, afraid of associating with outsiders. I promised myself then I'd never turn my back on someone who needed help. Not for fear, not for reputation, not for anything." Luke stirred again, his hand weakly grasping at Eliza's shoulder. "The papers," he managed. "In my coat. Proof." Daniel quickly searched the wounded man's pockets, finding a bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Even a cursory glance revealed damning evidence correspondence about forcing out the smaller ranchers, about using violence to provoke retaliation from the Apache bands, about railroad interests willing to pay handsomely for cleared land. "Sweet Jesus," Daniel breathed. "This goes all the way to—" "Later," Eliza interrupted. "First, we survive." They could hear the crowd now. Voices raised in angry debate. Some called for order, for waiting for the proper authorities. But louder voices demanded immediate justice, or what passed for it in a town where might too often made right. Daniel unhitched his gray stallion from behind the jail. Along with 2 other mounts he borrowed from the municipal stable. His movements were efficient. Practiced a man who'd learned that sometimes the law required breaking a few regulations to serve a greater good. As he helped Eliza secure Luke in the saddle, binding the semi-conscious man to her so he wouldn't fall, Daniel found himself studying her face. The widow Hart had always been something of an enigma in Coyote Bend, a woman who kept to herself, who'd refused to remarry despite numerous offers, who treated everyone from the wealthiest rancher to the poorest Mexican laborer with the same quiet dignity. Now, watching her risk everything for principles most folks only paid lip service to, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but recognition. Here was someone who understood that integrity meant more than comfort, that doing right often meant standing alone. "Ready?" he asked, checking the ammunition in his Winchester repeater. Eliza nodded, her arms wrapped protectively around Luke's torso, holding him steady against her. "Which way?" "South," Daniel decided. "Through the dry washes. The ground's too hard there to leave much trail. And there's a hidden spring about 15 miles out where we can rest." As they spurred their horses toward the edge of town, the sun reached its zenith, transforming the landscape into a shimmering vision of heat and light. The last thing Eliza saw as they left Coyote Bend behind was the crowd surging toward the jail, their shouts carrying on the desert wind like the cries of carrion birds. Ahead lay miles of unforgiving terrain, scorching days, freezing nights, and the constant threat of pursuit. But also, ahead lay the possibility of justice, of truth finally brought to light, of a love forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual respect. The widow bore her burden without complaint, her back straight despite the weight, her eyes fixed on the wavering horizon where earth met sky in a dance of heat mirages and distant promises. The jail's back courtyard offered blessed shade from the punishing sun, though the heat still radiated from the adobe walls like an oven. Daniel worked quickly, his hands steady despite the urgency thrumming through his veins. The gray stallion snorted nervously as he adjusted the saddle, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Eliza examined her medical supplies with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned healing through necessity. Her worn leather satchel contained precious little strips of clean cloth, a small bottle of grain alcohol, and a pouch of dried herbs she'd learned to use from an old Mexican woman who'd taken pity on her during her first brutal summer alone. She checked each item methodically, knowing that Luke's life might depend on these meager resources. "Can you hold him steady while I get him mounted?" Daniel asked, leading the gray closer. Together, they lifted Luke into the saddle. His face had taken on an alarming pallor, the kind that made Eliza remember other faces, her husband's among them, hovering at death's threshold. She climbed up behind him, wrapping one arm around his waist while using the other to fashion a crude harness from rope, binding them together. Her shoulders screamed in protest from the earlier strain, but she pushed the pain aside. There would be time for weakness later, when they were safe if such a time ever came. As she settled Luke against her chest, memories flooded back unbidden. Thomas, her late husband, burning with fever in their small cabin, his eyes bright with delirium, as she'd bathed his forehead with cool water that did nothing to break the heat consuming him. She'd promised him then, in those final hours, that she wouldn't let grief break her, wouldn't become one of those hollow-eyed widows who haunted the edges of frontier towns like living ghosts.
"Mrs. Hart,"
Daniel's voice brought her back to the present. "We need to move." They guided their horses through the maze of back alleys, keeping to the shadows where possible. Eliza could feel Luke's breathing, shallow but steady, against her chest. She began to speak to him, her voice low and continuous, the way she'd once gentled spooked horses on her homestead. "You hold on now. Mr. Calder, we're getting you somewhere safe. I know about that hidden spring Deputy Reyes mentioned, Sweet Mary Spring. The vaqueros call it good water there, and shade from the box elders. My Thomas and I camped there once, when we first came to the territory. He said the water tasted like promises." Daniel rode slightly ahead, his posture alert, hand never straying far from his Winchester. The badge on his chest caught the light occasionally, a reminder of the oath he was currently bending, if not breaking. He'd been a deputy for 3 years now, had tried to bring some measure of real law to Coyote Bend, but more and more, he'd found that the law as written served those who could afford to buy it, while justice, true justice, remained as elusive as rain in August. They reached the town's ragged edge where civilization gave way to wilderness. Before them stretched the Badlands, miles of red rock, desert scrub, and sun-baked earth that could kill the unprepared as surely as any bullet. Daniel paused, letting his horse drink from the last trough they'd see for miles. "There'll be no turning back after this," he said, not really speaking to anyone in particular. Eliza's response was to dig her heels gently into her mount's sides, urging it forward onto the trail. There never was any turning back, deputy, not from the moment I picked him up. They rode in silence for the first hour. The only sounds, the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on hard-packed earth, and Luke's occasional groans. The sun climbed higher, transforming the landscape into a shimmering hell of heat waves and mirages. Sweat soaked through Eliza's dress, making the fabric cling uncomfortably. She could feel Luke burning with fever against her, his body radiating heat that had nothing to do with the sun. As they navigated a narrow wash, Daniel finally gave voice to the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why were you even there, Mrs. Hart? That's a rough part of town for a woman alone." Eliza was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old sorrows. "I was bringing medicine to the Delgado family. Their youngest has the coughing sickness. Maria Delgado helped me after Thomas died, taught me which plants could heal, which could harm. I couldn't stand by when her child needed help. And Luke Calder, I heard the shot, found him crawling in the dust behind the old mission, trying to reach his horse. There was so much blood." She paused, adjusting her hold on the injured man. "He kept saying he had to warn someone, had to stop something. When I saw who he was, I knew there'd be trouble. The son of Amos Calder doesn't bleed in the street without consequences." Daniel nodded grimly. He knew the Calder name carried weight in the territory, the kind of weight that could crush those who stood against it. Yet here was Luke, shot for apparently trying to prevent violence rather than perpetrate it. The documents in his pocket suggested a conspiracy that reached beyond simple range wars. They stopped briefly at midday in the shade of a massive boulder. Eliza carefully lowered Luke to the ground, using her own body to cushion his descent. His eyes opened briefly, focusing with effort on her face. "Water," he whispered. She held her canteen to his lips, letting him take small sips. "Not too much," she cautioned. "We have to make it last." While Eliza tended to Luke, Daniel climbed the boulder to scan their back trail. No dust clouds yet, but he knew they were coming. The question was how many and how soon.
"Mrs. Hart!"
Luke's voice was stronger now, though still threaded with pain.
"I need to tell you." "Save your strength,"
Eliza said, but he gripped her hand with surprising force.
"No, if I don't."
The meeting was with Joseph Crowfeather, the Apache leader. Someone's planning to attack their winter stores. Make it look like the cavalry did it. Force them to retaliate. Then the army comes in, clears them out, and suddenly there's all this land available for the railroad. Daniel had climbed down in time to hear this. His face darkened. "Clayton Pike. Has to be. Your father's foreman has been itching for a fight with the Apache bands." Luke nodded weakly. "Pike, and others. There's a man named Dwyer, represents railroad interests. They've been paying Pike to stir up trouble. My father, he doesn't know. At least, I don't think he does." Eliza cleaned Luke's wound with the grain alcohol, biting her lip as he writhed in pain. The bullet had passed through the muscle below his shoulder blade, painful and bloody, but not immediately fatal if kept clean. She packed it with healing herbs and bound it tight with strips of cloth. "This will hold for now," she said, "but you need a real doctor." "No doctors in the desert," Daniel observed. "But the Apache bands have healers. If we can reach them, convince them we're not enemies." "You're talking about riding into an Apache camp with the son of Amos Calder?" Eliza asked. "They'd be within their rights to kill us all." "Maybe. Or maybe they'll see what I see, a man who risked his life to protect them, and a woman brave enough to save him." They mounted up again, Luke more alert now, but still weak. As they rode, Eliza found herself stealing glances at Daniel Reyes. She'd known him by sight in town, the Mexican deputy who tried to keep peace in a place that had little use for it. There'd been talk when he was first appointed. Ugly words from those who thought a badge should only grace an Anglo chest. But he'd proven himself fair, brave, and incorruptible, qualities rarer than gold in Coyote Bend. The landscape changed as they climbed higher, red rock giving way to scattered juniper and pinyon pine. The air grew marginally cooler, though the sun still pressed down like a flat iron. They followed game trails when possible, keeping to the hardest ground to minimize their tracks. As afternoon wore toward evening, Daniel called a halt at a cluster of wind-carved rocks. "We'll rest here for an hour. The horses need it, and so do we." Eliza helped Luke dismount, noting with relief that his color was better. The herbs were doing their work, fighting the infection that tried to take hold. She settled him in the shade, then turned to find Daniel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What is it?" "Deputy." "Daniel," he corrected softly. "Out here, I think we can dispense with titles." She nodded slowly. "Then you should call me Eliza." He smiled then, a brief flash that transformed his usually serious face. "Eliza, I was just thinking. I've been a lawman for 3 years, and in all that time, I've never seen anyone do what you did today. Most folks would have walked past, minded their own business. Most folks haven't watched someone they love die while others turned away." Eliza replied. "It changes you, makes you understand that sometimes all we have is each other." Daniel moved closer, his voice dropping. "Is that why you stayed in Coyote Bend after your husband passed? Most widows would have gone back east, or at least to a bigger town." Eliza's hands stilled on the medical supplies she'd been repacking. Thomas is buried here. This land, harsh as it is, was our dream. I couldn't abandon that dream just because he's no longer here to share it. And now, what dream drives you now? She looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing past the badge and the gun to the man beneath. Justice, I suppose, the dream that people like the Delgados can live without fear, that men like Luke can choose peace without being shot for it, that women like me can exist without being labeled and dismissed. That's a big dream for one person. Good thing I'm not alone. Then, she said, glancing meaningfully at him. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Luke stirred, breaking the spell, and they returned to the practical matters of survival. As they prepared to ride on, Eliza noticed Daniel checking his rifle, counting ammunition. The gesture reminded her that despite this strange intimacy born of shared danger, they were still being hunted. The civilized world they'd left behind would demand its own form of justice, one that had little to do with truth. How far to the spring? She asked. 5 miles? Maybe 6. We should reach it by nightfall. They mounted once more. 3 unlikely companions bound by circumstance and choice. As they rode toward the setting sun, Eliza felt the weight of the journey settling into her bones, but beneath the exhaustion was something else, a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. That truth could prevail over lies, that courage could overcome prejudice. Behind them, the first dust clouds appeared on the horizon, distant but unmistakable. The hunt had begun in earnest. The noon sun transformed the desert into a furnace, each breath burning in their lungs like they were swallowing fire. Luke's face had taken on a grayish pallor that made Eliza's heart clench with familiar dread. She rationed their water carefully, allowing him only small sips despite his fever-bright eyes pleading for more. Every drop was precious now, each swallow a calculated risk against what lay ahead. The leather of their saddles had grown so hot it burned through their clothing. Eliza could feel blisters forming where her skin met the scorching material, but she said nothing. Complaint was a luxury they couldn't afford. She shifted slightly, trying to ease the pressure on her shoulders while keeping Luke stable against her chest. Without warning, the wind shifted, carrying with it a wall of sand that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The storm hit them like a living thing, howling with primordial fury. The sky, moments before a merciless blue, transformed into a roiling mass of brown and gray. "Sandstorm!" Daniel shouted, though his voice was nearly lost in the wind's scream. "We need shelter!" But there was no shelter in this stretch of desert, only the illusion of it. They pulled their neckerchiefs up over their faces, bent low over their horses' necks, and pushed forward blind. The sand scoured exposed skin like 1,000 tiny knives, found its way into every gap in their clothing, filled their eyes and ears and noses with grit. Eliza wrapped her arms tighter around Luke, using her body to shield him from the worst of it. She could feel him shaking against her. Whether from fever or cold, she couldn't tell. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, the desert's cruel joke burning by day, freezing by night, and sometimes both within the span of an hour. The horses struggled forward, their instincts better than any human guidance in this brown hell. Eliza buried her face in Luke's shoulder, breathing through the fabric of his shirt, and tried to remember the words to her mother's old prayers. But the wind stole even thoughts, leaving only the primal need to endure. Time lost meaning in the storm. It could have been minutes or hours before the wind began to die, the sand settling back to earth like exhausted dancers after a wild reel. When Eliza finally raised her head, the landscape had changed. Dunes had shifted, familiar landmarks erased, their carefully chosen path obliterated. Daniel spat out a mouthful of grit, his face a mask of sand and sweat. "Is everyone all right?" "Define all right," Eliza croaked, her throat raw. She checked on Luke, alarmed to find him barely conscious. The storm had sapped what little strength he'd recovered. They'd lost the trail completely. Daniel dismounted, studying the sun's position, trying to orient himself in this newly arranged world. Eliza watched him pace, seeing the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Out here, a wrong decision meant death. There, she said suddenly, pointing to a distant formation of rock that looked like a row of broken teeth. I remember those from when Thomas and I came through. If we keep them to our left, we should hit the old cattle trail. Daniel looked at her with new respect. You've got a good eye for the land. When you're alone out here, you learn to pay attention, she replied, then busied herself cleaning sand from Luke's face with precious water from her canteen. The fever had taken firm hold now, Luke muttered in his delirium, calling for his father, for someone named Margaret, for the Apache leader he'd tried to meet. Sometimes he spoke in Spanish. Words Eliza recognized from her interactions with the Mexican families in town. Words of warning, of danger, of sorrow. Margaret, Luke said clearly, his eyes suddenly focusing on Eliza's face. I'm sorry. I should have married you. Should have stood up to him. Eliza's hands stilled. She'd heard gossip about Luke Calder's broken engagement to Margaret Thornwood, the judge's daughter. The story went that Amos Calder had forbidden the match, deeming the Thornwoods too liberal in their politics, too sympathetic to the wrong sorts of people. Shh, she soothed, wiping his brow. Save your strength. But Luke gripped her hand with surprising force. No, you need to know, Margaret. She found out about the railroad scheme. That's why Father sent her away. Said he'd ruin her family if she spoke. But she left me the evidence. It's all there, in those papers. Daniel had been listening. He pulled out the oilcloth bundle, examining the documents more carefully. His face darkened as he read. Jesus Christ, this goes deeper than we thought. There are signed agreements here, promises of government contracts, mentions of officials in Santa Fe and even Washington. They mounted up again, following Eliza's landmarks. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and deadly. Like everything in this land, they'd gone perhaps 2 miles when Daniel raised his hand, signaling a stop. Listen. At first, Eliza heard nothing but the wind and their horses breathing. Then, faint but distinct, came the ring of shod hooves on stone, many hooves. They're tracking us, Daniel said grimly. Maybe 3 miles back, moving fast. Eliza felt her heart skip, but her voice remained steady. Can we outrun them? Not with Luke in his condition, and our horses are exhausted. Daniel scanned the horizon, his tactical mind working. There's a box canyon about a mile east. Dead end, but defensible. Or we push for the spring and hope we reach the Apache bands first. What are our chances with the Apache? Better than with a lynch mob, Daniel said. At least they might listen before they shoot. The decision was made for them when Luke suddenly convulsed, his body going rigid with fever. Eliza barely kept him from falling as he thrashed against her hold. When the seizure passed, he was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid. He needs help now, Eliza said. Real help, not just herbs and hope. Daniel nodded. The canyon. We'll make our stand there if we have to. They urged their tired horses to one last effort, racing against the approaching darkness and their pursuers. The canyon entrance appeared like a gash in the earth, narrow enough that 2 men could hold it against many. Daniel led them deep inside, to where a small seep created a patch of green in the stone wilderness. As Eliza lowered Luke to the ground, she marveled at the place. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, spirals and handprints and figures that seemed to dance in the dying light. This was a sacred place, she realized. Somewhere humans had sought shelter and meaning for countless generations. Look, Daniel said softly, pointing to evidence of a recent campfire. Someone's been here, recently, as if summoned by his words. Figures materialized from the shadows, Apache warriors, moving with the fluid grace of men who belonged to this land in ways the newcomers never could. Eliza counted 6, then 8, their rifles held ready but not yet aimed. An older woman stepped forward from behind the warriors. Her face was weathered by decades of desert sun, but her eyes were sharp as obsidian blades. She looked at Luke, at the blood on his shirt, at Eliza's protective posture, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Eliza made a decision born of desperation and instinct, moving slowly. She held out both hands, palms up, in the universal gesture of supplication. Then, reaching into her memory for the few Apache words she'd learned from an old scout, she spoke. "Help, please. He tried to protect your people." The woman stepped closer, studying them. Her eyes lingered on Daniel's badge, on the rifles they carried, on the documents scattered around Luke's unconscious form. Then she knelt beside Luke, her hands moving over his wound with practiced skill. She spoke rapidly in Apache to one of the warriors, who disappeared into the darkness. Then, in accented but clear English, she addressed Eliza. "This one. He is the son of Amos Calder." "Yes," Eliza admitted, seeing no point in lies. "He came to the meeting place. Joseph Crow Feather waited. Then gunshots. Soldiers. We thought. But now?" She gestured at Luke's wound. "Shot from behind. Not soldiers' way." Daniel stepped forward carefully. "There's a conspiracy. Men who want war, who profit from it." Luke was trying to stop them. The woman considered this, her face unreadable. Around them, the warriors remained still as statues, waiting for her decision. In the distance, as carried on the night wind, came the sound of their pursuers, horses and men and dogs, the machinery of frontier justice grinding closer. "You bring danger to us," the woman said finally. "We bring truth," Eliza countered, "and a chance to prevent a war that would destroy us all." The woman stood, dignified despite her worn clothing. "I am Maria Broken Wing. I speak for the women of our band. The men will want to turn you away, or worse. But I see something here." She looked directly at Eliza. "You carry him, though he is not your blood, not your husband. Why?" Eliza met her gaze steadily. "Because it's right. Because someone has to stand between the strong and the weak, between lies and truth, because I've lost too much to fear losing more." Maria Broken Wing nodded slowly. Then she spoke again to the warriors, her voice carrying an authority that transcended gender or age. The men lowered their weapons, though their expressions remained wary. "We will help," Maria announced. "But first, we must survive the night. Your hunters come with many guns and much hate. This canyon, it can be defended, but also can become a trap." She issued rapid orders. Some warriors moved to the canyon entrance. Others began gathering materials for medicine. The one who had disappeared earlier returned with herbs and clean water. Maria herself knelt beside Luke, beginning the real work of healing. As she worked, she spoke to Eliza. "You know healing plants. I can smell them on your hands. Watch, learn. Desert teaches those who listen." Daniel organized their defense, working with the Apache warriors despite the language barrier. Mutual survival had a way of breaking down walls that seemed insurmountable in easier times. He showed them the documents, using gestures and the few Spanish words they shared to communicate their importance. Night fell completely, bringing with it the desert cold. They built a small fire, shielded by rocks to hide its light. Maria had cleaned and packed Luke's wound with a poultice that smelled of sage and something else Eliza couldn't identify. His fever had broken, though he remained unconscious. "He will live," Maria pronounced, "if infection does not take him, if bullets do not find him again." The sound of pursuit had stopped, but they all knew what that meant. Their hunters were planning, waiting for dawn, preparing for an assault on the canyon. In the firelight, Eliza saw her own fear reflected in the faces around her, Apache and Mexican and Anglo, all united in this moment by the common threat of men who dealt in hate and greed.
Tell me,
Maria said suddenly, fixing Eliza with that penetrating gaze.
When morning comes, when they demand you give up this man or die, what then?
Eliza looked at Luke's sleeping face, at Daniel checking his ammunition, at the warriors preparing for a battle they hadn't sought. She thought of her husband's grave, of promises made and kept, of the cruel beauty of this land that tested everyone who dared to call it home. Then we fight, she said simply. And if we die standing for something better than what they represent. Maria Broken Wing smiled then, an expression that transformed her weathered face. You have spine, white woman, perhaps enough to survive what comes. As if in response to her words, a coyote howled somewhere in the darkness, that wild, mournful sound that gave Coyote Bend its name. Others took up the call, creating a chorus that seemed to mock human ambitions and suffering alike. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter and settled in beside Luke, one hand on his chest to monitor his breathing, the other never far from the pistol Daniel had given her. Tomorrow would bring violence and possibly death. But tonight, in this ancient sanctuary decorated with the hopes and fears of long-dead peoples, she had found something she hadn't expected: allies in the most unlikely place, and a love that was growing not from passion but from shared purpose. The desert waited, patient and eternal, to see who would survive the coming storm. Back in Coyote Bend, the saloon had become a war council. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the sour smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. Clayton Pike stood at the center of it all, his hand resting on his pearl-handled Colt, his eyes glinting with the kind of madness that passed for leadership in lawless places.
The boy's a traitor,
Pike declared, his voice cutting through the murmur of assembled men.
Caught him myself, meeting with those Apache savages.
Would have sold us all out for a handful of silver. Amos Calder sat in the corner, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. The most powerful rancher in the territory looked suddenly old, his weathered face drawn with confusion and rage. His son, his only son, accused of the worst kind of betrayal. The weight of it sat on his shoulders like a millstone. I want to hear it from Luke himself, Amos said, his voice gravelly with suppressed emotion. Pike's smile was sharp as a skinning knife. Of course, Mr. Calder. Soon as we bring him back. Dead or alive, as they say.
Alive,
Amos snapped.
I'll have him alive. Pike!
From the shadows near the door, Harrison Dwyer watched the proceedings with calculating eyes. The railroad man had cultivated his appearance carefully, Eastern clothes just rumpled enough to seem approachable, spectacles that made him look scholarly rather than scheming. He stepped forward now, clearing his throat delicately. Gentlemen, perhaps we're allowing emotion to cloud our judgment. Young Luke Calder is clearly confused, possibly under the influence of unsavory elements. His eyes flicked meaningfully toward the door, where everyone knew the Mexican quarter lay. What we need is a restoration of order. The railroad is prepared to offer substantial compensation to ensure the safety of its future routes. The implication was clear. Money for those who helped, ruin for those who didn't. How much? Someone called from the back. Dwyer's smile was thin. Enough to make every man here comfortable. Enough to turn Coyote Bend from a dusty way station into a proper town. But first, we need to resolve this unfortunate situation. Pike seized the moment. I've got 20 men ready to ride. We know they headed south, that Mexican deputy's leading them right to the Apache camps. If we move fast, we can end this before it becomes a war. It's already a war, Amos said quietly. Has been since the first Apache raid 20 years ago. No, sir, Pike countered, his voice taking on an evangelical fervor. That was survival. This what your boy's done, this is betrayal. He's chosen them over his own kind. The words hit Amos like physical blows. He'd built his empire on a foundation of blood and determination, driven the Apache from the best grazing land,
fought Mexican landholders in the courts and in the streets when necessary. The idea that his son would throw it all away for some misguided notion of peace was incomprehensible. Mr. Calder, Dwyer interjected smoothly. Consider the bigger picture. The territory is on the verge of a new era. The railroad will bring prosperity, civilization, progress, but only if we can guarantee safe passage. Your son's idealism threatens everything we've worked for. Amos stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Every eye in the room followed him as he walked to the window, staring out at the dusty street where his son had been carried away by a widow and a Mexican deputy. My wife, he said slowly, God rest her soul, used to say Luke had too much of her in him. Too soft, she worried, too quick to see both sides. He turned back to face the room. I tried to beat it out of him, make him hard, like this land demands. Seems I failed. Pike saw his opening. You didn't fail, Mr. Calder. The boy failed you. But we can fix this, bring him back, make him see reason. Or if he won't see reason, he let the alternative hang in the air like a noose. What about the woman? Someone asked. The Hart widow. Pike's face twisted with disgust. Indian lover. Probably put ideas in the boy's head. Her and that Mexican deputy both. They'll hang alongside him if I have my way. Now hold on, Amos said sharply. Nobody said anything about hanging. What did you think would happen? Pike challenged. You send us after traitors and conspirators. There's only one way it ends. Unless... He paused dramatically. Unless you're having second thoughts about your own loyalty. Mr. Calder. The room went deadly quiet. To question Amos Calder's loyalty was to question the sun's right to rise. Men's hands drifted toward their weapons, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Amos's voice, when it came, was soft as a snake's rattle and twice as dangerous. Choose your next words very carefully. Pike. But Dwyer stepped between them, hands raised placatingly. Gentlemen, please. We're all on the same side here. Mr. Pike. Surely you're not questioning Mr. Calder's commitment to our cause, and Mr. Calder, surely you understand that harsh times call for harsh measures. The moment stretched taut as wire. Then Amos nodded slowly. Bring my son back. Let me talk to him. If he's truly turned traitor... He couldn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was clear. Pike smiled triumphantly. You heard the man. Mount up, we ride within the hour. As men scattered to prepare, Dwyer lingered, approaching Amos with studied casualness. A difficult position. Mr. Calder, no man should have to choose between his son and his principles. What do you want, Dwyer? Only to help. The railroad has resources, influence. When this unfortunate business is concluded, we'll need strong local partners. Men of vision who understand that progress sometimes requires sacrifice. Amos studied the smaller man with the eyes that had seen too much. You're talking about my son's life like it's a business transaction. Everything is a business transaction. Mr. Calder. The only question is whether you'll profit from it or be crushed by it. Outside, the sound of horses and men preparing for the hunt filled the air. Pike's voice rose above the din, issuing orders with military precision. He'd been a sergeant in the Confederate Army, had learned his trade in blood and defeat. Now he applied those lessons to a different kind of war, one where the enemy was anyone who stood in the way of profit. In her small house on the Mexican side of town, Maria Delgado clutched her sick child and prayed. She'd seen Eliza Hart that morning, had watched through her window as the widow carried the wounded man through hostile streets. The medicine Eliza had brought might save her daughter's life, but now Eliza herself was in mortal danger. Maria's husband, Roberto, stood by the window, his face grim. They're forming a lynch mob, he said quietly. Pike's whipping them into a frenzy. We should do something, Maria whispered. What, we're Mexicans. They barely tolerate us as it is. If we speak up for the widow... He didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to Mexicans who forgot their place. But Maria thought of Eliza's kind eyes, of the way she'd knelt by little Rosa's bedside, gentle hands checking for fever. She helped us when no one else would. And now she'll die for it, Roberto said bitterly. That's what kindness gets you in Coyote Bend. Back in the saloon, Amos Calder made his decision. Pike. The foreman turned, eager as a hunting dog scenting prey. When you find them, Amos said heavily, you bring Luke to me. No harm comes to him until I've had my say. Understood. And the others? Amos was quiet for a long moment. Then, the deputy was just doing his job, misguided as it was. The woman. He thought of his late wife, of her gentle nature that he'd loved and despised in equal measure. The woman was trying to help, that's all. Pike's face darkened. You're going soft, old man. The words had barely left his mouth when Amos's fist connected with his jaw, sending Pike sprawling into a table. The room exploded into chaos as Pike's men reached for their guns, only to find themselves facing the weapons of Calder's loyal hands. Amos stood over Pike, his chest heaving. I said bring them back alive, all of them. You spill innocent blood, and I'll see you hang for it myself. Pike wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage, but he nodded. Yes, sir, alive it is. As Pike stalked out, Dwyer approached Amos again. That was unwise. Pike has friends, influence of his own. Let him come. Amos growled. I've buried better men than Clayton Pike. I'm sure you have, but consider your son has already chosen his side. Why risk everything for people who mean nothing to you? Amos looked at the railroad man with sudden clarity. You know what? Dwyer. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've spent so long deciding who means something and who doesn't. We've forgotten how to be human. He walked out then, leaving Dwyer alone with his calculations and schemes. The railroad man adjusted his spectacles, mind already working on contingencies, if Amos Calder wouldn't play his part. Perhaps it was time for new leadership in Coyote Bend. Outside, Pike was rallying his men. Listen up, we ride hard. We ride fast. The old man wants them alive. So alive they'll be, but accidents happen in the desert. Man resists arrest, tries to escape. He smiled coldly. Well, we'll just have to do what's necessary. The men understood. They'd follow Amos Calder's orders to the letter. And if those orders left room for interpretation, so much the better. As the mob prepared to ride out, a figure watched from the mission bell tower. Father Miguel, the old priest who ministered to the Mexican community, crossed himself and began to pray. He'd seen mobs before, in Texas, in California, wherever men let fear and greed override their conscience. He thought of the Hart widow, who came to light candles for her dead husband, even though she wasn't Catholic. He thought of Deputy Reyes, who tried so hard to be fair in an unfair world. He thought of young Luke Calder, who'd come to him once, secretly, asking about the Apache beliefs, trying to understand rather than simply hate. All of them out there now, hunted like animals, while evil men twisted justice into a noose. Father Miguel made his own decision. Climbing down from the bell tower, he went to saddle his old mule. Someone needed to warn the hunted. Someone needed to bear witness. And if an old priest disappeared into the desert for a few days, who would notice or care? The sun was setting by the time Pike's mob thundered out of Coyote Bend, raising a cloud of dust visible for miles. Behind them, the town seemed to exhale, exhausted by its own hatred. In the saloon, Dwyer penned a telegram to his superiors, reporting that matters were progressing as planned. In his ranch house, Amos Calder sat alone, staring at a photograph of his late wife and wondering where everything had gone so wrong. And in the desert, the hunted pressed on, unaware that their fate was being decided by men who saw them not as people, but as obstacles to be removed. The night was coming, bringing with it the promise of violence and the slim hope of redemption. The mountain camp materialized from the mist like something from an ancient dream. Hidden in a natural bowl of red rock, sheltered by centuries-old pines, it seemed to exist outside of time. Children played near the central fire, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the gravity of the situation. Women worked at traditional crafts while keeping watchful eyes on the canyon approaches. Warriors moved between defensive positions with practiced ease. Luke Calder was healing. Maria Broken Wing's medicines had drawn the poison from his wound, and rest had begun to restore his strength. He could walk now, though carefully. One hand pressed to his bandaged side. Eliza watched him attempt a few steps in the morning light, noting how the arrogance had been stripped from his bearing, leaving something more genuine in its place. "Easy," she cautioned, moving to steady him as he swayed. "Maria said the wound needs at least another week before you can ride." Luke's smile was rueful. "We might not have a week." He gestured toward the canyon entrance where Daniel stood watch with 2 Apache scouts. "They're coming. We all know it." Over the past days, an unlikely community had formed, the Apache Band, led by Joseph Crow Feather and advised by Maria Broken Wing, had taken in the fugitives not out of charity but from a pragmatic understanding that their enemies were the same. Luke's presence, the son of their greatest oppressor, wounded while trying to prevent violence against them, had shifted something fundamental in the careful balance of hatred and survival. Eliza had thrown herself into camp life with characteristic determination. Maria taught her the medicinal properties of mountain plants, which roots stopped bleeding, which bark eased fever, which leaves could draw poison from a wound. In return, Eliza shared her own knowledge, gleaned from Mexican curanderas and pioneer women. The 2 women worked side by side, their hands busy with healing while their minds grappled with larger questions. "Your young man," Maria said one morning as they gathered herbs. "He is changing." Eliza glanced toward where Luke sat with Joseph Crow Feather. The 2 men engaged in halting conversation, part English, part Spanish, part gesture. "He's not my young man." Maria's knowing smile said otherwise. "The heart chooses strangely sometimes. My husband was Chiricahua. My family said I was mad to marry outside our band, but 20 winters we had together before the soldiers came." Her voice carried old grief, worn smooth by time. Love does not ask permission. That evening, Eliza found Luke sitting alone on a ledge overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. She settled beside him, careful to leave proper distance between them. "I've been a fool," Luke said without preamble. "All my life, I've looked at the Apache as enemies. Never wondered why they fought us. Never thought about what we were taking from them." "Most people don't," Eliza replied. "It's easier to hate what you don't understand." Luke turned to study her profile in the dying light. "But you did. You helped the Mexican families. Traded with the Apache when you could. Why?" Eliza was quiet for a long moment, gathering words like scattered seeds. "When Thomas died, I could have become bitter. Could have blamed God, or the land, or the fever that took him. But bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting others to die from it. I chose differently. And that choice led you to carry a wounded stranger through hostile streets. That choice led me here," she corrected gently. "To understanding that we're all just people trying to survive in a hard land. Apache, Mexican, Anglo, we all bleed red. We all mourn our dead. We all want our children to have better than we did." Luke's hand found hers, the touch tentative as a yearling colt. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Eliza Hart." The words hung in the air between them like suspended stars. Eliza felt her heart race, but her voice remained steady. "You're grateful. There's a difference." "No." His grip tightened slightly. "Gratitude is what I feel toward Maria for saving my life. What I feel for you." He paused, searching for words. "You make me want to be better than I am, to be worthy of the risk you took." Before Eliza could respond, a commotion arose from the camp below. Daniel was returning from a scout.
his face grim. They hurried down to hear his report. "Pikes made camp at Skeleton Springs," Daniel announced to the gathered council. "At least 30 men, maybe more. They'll reach the canyon by noon tomorrow." Joseph Crow Feather, a man whose dignity had survived decades of conflict, spoke carefully in accented English. "We could retreat deeper into the mountains. My people know paths the white men will never find." "And leave us to face them alone." Luke shook his head. "I won't have anyone else pay for my choices." "Our choices," Eliza corrected firmly. An argument erupted. Some warriors advocating for attack, others for retreat. Maria's voice cut through the discord like a blade. "Fighting means death for many. Running means we abandon these three who risked much for truth. Where is the honor in either path?" It was young Samuel Red Sky, barely 16 winters. Who proposed the solution? The old ways speak of trial by testimony. When accusations divide the people, let all sides speak their truth before witnesses. The guilty are revealed by their own words. Joseph Crow Feather nodded slowly. "And who would witness such a trial? Pike will not respect Apache justice." "But he might respect mine," a new voice said from the darkness. Everyone turned as Father Miguel rode into the firelight on his ancient mule, travel-worn but radiating the quiet authority of his calling. Behind him rode two unexpected figures, Judge Theodore Thornwood and his daughter Margaret. Luke started forward. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Margaret Thornwood, dressed in practical riding clothes that scandalized proper society, dismounted with easy grace. "What I should have done months ago. Standing up to your father and his hired killers." She produced a leather portfolio. "I have documents. Luke, letters between Pike and Dwyer. Plans to provoke violence. Lists of bribes paid. Everything we need to prove conspiracy." Judge Thornwood, a man whose integrity had made him enemies throughout the territory, added his weight to the moment. "I've sent word to the federal marshal in Santa Fe, but that will take time we don't have. Father Miguel's suggestion of a field tribunal might be our best option." "You're talking about law and trials," Daniel said bitterly. "Pike's bringing a lynch mob. Then we make the mob a jury." The judge replied, "Most of those men are followers, not leaders. Show them the truth. Give them a way to step back from murder, and some will take it." Through the night, they planned. It was a desperate gambit, relying on the thin hope that even hardened men might choose justice over vengeance if given the chance. The Apache would provide security but remain hidden unless violence erupted. The judge would establish legal authority. The evidence would be presented in full view of all. As dawn approached, Eliza found herself unable to sleep. She walked to the spring that fed the camp, finding Daniel already there, staring into the dark water. "Regrets?" she asked softly. Daniel's smile was sad. "Only that I didn't act sooner. I knew Pike was corrupt, knew the system was rigged against anyone who wasn't white and wealthy. But I told myself I could change things from within, work the system." He skipped a stone across the water. "Turns out the system was working me." "You're here now. That matters." "Is it enough?" He turned to face her fully. "I watch you with Luke, the way you look at each other. And I think about roads not taken." Eliza's heart ached for him. "Daniel." "No, let me say this." His voice was gentle but firm. "I could have loved you, Eliza Hart. Maybe I already do, in my way. But I see how you are with him, how he is with you. That's the real thing, the kind of love that changes people." He touched her shoulder briefly. "Be happy, that's all I want." Before she could respond, he walked away, back straight despite the weight he carried. Eliza watched him go, understanding that sometimes the greatest love was knowing when to let go. The camp stirred with first light. Warriors applied paint in ritual patterns. Maria prepared medicine bundles for the wounded who would surely come. Margaret and her father reviewed their legal strategies one final time. And at the center of it all, Luke Calder prepared to face his father's wrath and his own past. Eliza helped him into a clean shirt,
her fingers gentle around his healing wound. "Whatever happens today, we face it together." Luke finished. "I'm done running from who I am, from what's right. My father built an empire on blood and fear. Maybe it's time someone in the Calder name stood for something better." Joseph Crowfeather approached them, his face grave but not unkind. In his hands was a ceremonial blanket. "Luke Calder," he said formally. "You came to our meeting place seeking peace. You bled for that purpose. This does not erase the past, but it opens a path to the future." He draped the blanket around Luke's shoulders. The gesture was simple but profound, an acknowledgement that enemies could choose to become allies, that the cycle of violence could be broken by those brave enough to extend a hand across the divide. As the sun climbed higher, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, the camp prepared for what would come. Children and elders were moved to safety deeper in the mountains. Warriors took positions along the rim. The judge set up his makeshift court in the open ground before the canyon entrance, where all could see. Eliza stood with Luke and Daniel, watching the dust cloud that marked Pike's approach. Her hand found Luke's, their fingers intertwining with the easy certainty of two people who'd found home in each other. "Are you afraid?" Luke asked. "Terrified," Eliza admitted. "But my mother used to say courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear." "Your mother was a wise woman." She would have liked you. I think the man you're becoming, not the man you were." The dust cloud grew larger, resolved into individual riders. At their head rode Clayton Pike, his face set in lines of grim satisfaction. Behind him came the mob, armed and angry, ready for the violence they'd been promised. But they would find something else waiting for them: truth, testimony, and the radical possibility that justice could prevail even in a land where might had always made right. The mountain camp held its breath, poised between past and future, waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Dawn broke blood red over the mountains, painting the rocks in shades of warning. The small band of fugitives moved with practiced quiet. Luke now strong enough to ride alone, though Eliza stayed close, watching for signs of weakness. Daniel led them through paths known only to hunters and outlaws, away from the mountain sanctuary that had sheltered them. They'd traveled barely 2 hours when Daniel raised his hand, signaling a halt. Below them, near a dried stream bed, a plume of dust marked riders moving fast, too fast for a normal patrol. "Down," Daniel hissed, and they dismounted, leading their horses into a cluster of boulders. From their hiding place, they watched the riders pass a scouting party, 5 men with rifles at the ready. Eliza recognized one of them, Jake Morrison, who'd spat at her feet once when she dared to shop on the Anglo side of town. The men were heading directly for the mountain camp. "We have to warn them," Luke whispered urgently. "No time," Daniel replied. "They'll reach the camp before we could circle back. Joseph Crowfeather has lookouts posted. They'll see them coming." But Luke was already moving, his face set with determination. "Then we create a distraction. Draw them off." Before anyone could stop him, he'd mounted his horse and spurred it into the open, riding hard across the scouts' line of sight. The effect was immediate. Shouts erupted from below as the riders wheeled their mounts, giving chase to their primary target. "Damn fool," Daniel muttered, but he was already mounting up. "Stay here," he told Eliza. "Like hell," she shot back, swinging into her saddle. They raced after Luke, the landscape blurring past in a thunder of hooves and dust. Luke was heading for rougher ground, trying to lead the scouts away from any path back to the camp. But his wound, though healing, still sapped his strength. Eliza could see him swaying in the saddle. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past Luke's head. Then another, kicking up dust near his horse's hooves. The animal shied, nearly throwing him. Daniel pulled his rifle, firing back at the scouts to slow them down. "Head for Box Canyon," he shouted. We can hold them there.
But it was too late. Luke's horse stumbled on loose shale. Going down hard, Luke rolled clear but lay still, clutching his side where fresh blood seeped through his shirt. The wound had reopened. Eliza reached him first, throwing herself from her horse and covering his body with her own as more shots rang out. "Don't you dare die on me now," she said fiercely. "Not after everything." Daniel had taken position behind a fallen log, his rifle speaking in measured intervals, keeping the scouts at bay. But they were spreading out, trying to flank their position. It would only be minutes before they were surrounded. That's when they heard a sound that made the scouts freeze in their tracks. War cries, echoing off the canyon walls. Apache warriors appeared on the ridgeline above, bows drawn, rifles aimed. At their head rode Joseph Crowfeather himself, his face painted for war. The scouts pulled up short, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered and outpositioned. Jake Morrison's face went pale beneath his trail dust. These weren't the helpless victims they'd expected to find. "Drop your weapons," Joseph Crowfeather commanded, his English clear and cold, "or die where you stand." For a moment, violence trembled in the air like heat shimmer. Then, one by one, the scouts let their rifles fall. They knew the stories, knew what happened to those who fought Apache warriors in their own territory. But violence wasn't what came next. Instead, as Eliza helped Luke to his feet, Joseph Crowfeather spoke again. "You came hunting, now you are the hunted, but we are not like you. We do not kill the helpless." He gestured to his warriors. "Tie them. They will witness what comes next." As the scouts were secured, their leader, a man named Carl Hutchins, found his voice. "Pike'll kill you all for this. Every last one of you." "Pike is the one who should fear," Joseph replied calmly. "Truth has a way of finding daylight, even in dark times." They made their way to Box Canyon, the captured scouts under heavy guard. The canyon was, as Daniel had described, a natural fortress with high walls and only one way in or out. But what they found there made Eliza's heart sink. The rest of Pike's mob had already arrived. 30 men strong, arranged in a rough semicircle before the canyon entrance. At their center stood Clayton Pike himself, his hand resting on his gun, his face wearing the satisfied expression of a cat that had cornered its prey. But he wasn't alone. Amos Calder sat his horse beside Pike, his weathered face unreadable. And with them, surprisingly, was Judge Thornwood, though his presence seemed more captive than voluntary. "Well, well," Pike called out as they approached. "The prodigal son returns, and in interesting company." Luke straightened in his saddle, meeting his father's eyes. "Father, I suppose you've come to see Pike's version of justice done." Amos studied his son, the Apache blanket around his shoulders, the protective way Eliza stayed close to him, the alliance with men he'd been taught to hate. Something flickered in the old man's eyes. Pain. Regret. It was gone too quickly to tell. "I came to hear the truth," Amos said finally. "The judge here says you have evidence, papers that tell a different story than Pike's been spinning." Pike's hand moved toward his gun. "Don't need no papers to see what's plain. Your boy's turned traitor, thrown in with savages and Mexican lovers." "Stand down, Pike." Amos's voice carried the authority of decades of command. "I'll hear what my son has to say." It was then that the unexpected happened. From the rocks above, more figures emerged. Margaret Thornwood, flanked by Father Miguel and a contingent of townspeople, Mexican families, small ranchers, even a few Anglo merchants who'd grown tired of Pike's brutal methods. They'd come to bear witness, to ensure that whatever happened here happened in the light of day. "Amos," Judge Thornwood said, his voice carrying despite his apparent captivity, "your son tried to prevent a massacre. Pike shot him for it. These are facts, not opinions." "Lies," Pike snarled. "The boy was selling us out to the Apache." "Then let's see the evidence." Margaret stepped forward, the leather portfolio in her hands.
Let's show everyone here what's really been happening." What followed was extraordinary. There in the desert, with armed men on all sides and violence hanging in the air like smoke, an impromptu trial began. Margaret produced document after document contracts between Dwyer and Eastern investors, orders from Pike to his men to provoke incidents, lists of bribes paid to territorial officials. The Apache scouts who'd witnessed the original meeting testified through Joseph Crow Feather's translation. Luke, supported by Eliza, told his story how he'd discovered the conspiracy, tried to warn the Apache, been shot by his own father's foreman. As the evidence mounted, Eliza watched the faces of Pike's mob. Some remained stony, committed to their hatred, but others began to shift uncomfortably, to exchange glances, to edge away from Pike's immediate circle. "You gonna believe this?" Pike demanded of his men. "Gonna take the word of Indians and Mexicans over your own kind?" "I believe my own eyes," said Tom Garrett, one of the older ranchers. "And what I see is you've been playing us for fools. Pike, starting fights so the railroad could steal our land along with theirs." The mood was shifting. The mob becoming something else, a community grappling with uncomfortable truths. But Pike wasn't finished. In one smooth motion, he drew his gun, aiming at Luke. "Enough talk," he snarled. "Boy's guilty of treason, and the sentence is—" The shot that rang out didn't come from Pike's gun. Amos Calder, the man who'd built an empire on ruthless pragmatism, had drawn faster than his younger foreman. Pike's gun flew from his hand as he clutched his bleeding wrist. "Nobody," Amos said quietly. "Nobody threatens my son. Whatever he's done, whatever he's chosen, he's still my blood." In the stunned silence that followed, Eliza felt Luke sag against her. She looked down to see fresh blood soaking his shirt. The exertion, the stress, had taken its toll. He was fading fast. "Please," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "He needs help. This has to end." It was Maria Broken Wing who stepped forward from among the Apache contingent, her medicine bag in hand. "I will tend him," she announced, "as I would tend any wounded soul. This is not about Apache or white or Mexican. This is about choosing between healing and hurting." As Maria worked over Luke, Amos dismounted and approached his son. Father and son looked at each other across a gulf of years and choices. "Why?" Amos asked simply. Luke's voice was weak but clear. "Because someone had to say enough. Because I looked at what we were building and realized it was built on graves. Because I met her." He glanced at Eliza and learned that strength isn't about taking, it's about protecting. Amos was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprising everyone, he knelt beside his son. "Your mother would be proud," he said roughly. I forgot her lessons. Let Pike and men like him convince me that hard meant cruel, that strong meant heartless." He stood, facing the assembled crowd. "The conspiracy is real. I see that now. Any man who wants to ride away, do it now. No shame in walking away from a lie." One by one, then in groups, Pike's mob began to disperse. Some muttered, some cursed, but faced with the truth and their employer's change of heart, they had no stomach for the fight Pike had promised them. Pike himself, cradling his wounded hand, looked around at his vanishing support. "You're all fools," he spat. "The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Progress doesn't stop for sentiment." "Maybe not," Judge Thornwood said, "but it can be guided by law instead of greed. You're under arrest, Mr. Pike, for attempted murder, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges I'll enjoy detailing." As Pike was led away by some of the townsmen who'd come with the judge, Amos turned to Joseph Crow Feather. The two men who'd been enemies for decades faced each other in the desert sun. "I've wronged your people," Amos said simply. "I can't undo the past. But maybe we can talk about the future." Joseph Crow Feather studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Talk is a beginning." As the sun climbed toward noon, the immediate crisis passed. Luke would live, though he'd need careful tending. The conspiracy was exposed, though dealing with its tentacles would take time, and here in the desert, ancient enemies had taken the first tentative steps towards something that might, someday, become peace. Eliza knelt beside Luke as Maria finished rebandaging his wound. His eyes found hers, full of pain, but also hope. "Still think I'm just grateful?" he asked with a weak smile. She leaned down and kissed him gently. "I think you're a fool who nearly got himself killed trying to do the right thing." "Takes one to know one," he murmured. Around them, the desert began to empty as various groups departed, but the change that had begun here would ripple outward like water in a still pond, touching lives and reshaping a territory's future. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation anyone had expected, but perhaps that was the point. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from violence, but from the courage to stand in the light and speak truth, even when your voice shook. The night air in Coyote Bend carried tension like dust before a storm. Eliza and Daniel moved through the shadows, their stolen moments precious as they gathered evidence and allies. Word had spread through the Mexican quarter and among the small ranchers tomorrow. The railroad's hired guns would stage a mock trial for Luke Calder, ending with a lynching designed to spark the violence they needed. In the rectory of the small mission church, Father Miguel had hidden the documents Margaret Thornwood had risked everything to preserve. Eliza knelt before the wooden chest, her hands trembling slightly as she sorted through papers by lamplight. Each page revealed another thread in the web of conspiracy payments to territorial officials, forged land claims, orders for weapon shipments. "This one," Daniel said quietly, pointing to a letter bearing Harrison Dwyer's seal. "Look at the date, 3 days before the Apache raid on the Pemberton Ranch. Pike's men dressed as Apache staged the whole thing." Eliza's jaw tightened. She remembered the Pembertons, a young couple with 2 small children, burned out of their home, the husband killed defending his family. The territory had howled for Apache blood after that raid, never questioning why warriors would attack a hardscrabble farm with nothing worth stealing. "We need to get these to Judge Thornwood," she said, carefully wrapping the most damning documents in oilcloth. "Already done," a voice said from the doorway. Margaret Thornwood stepped into the light, dressed in men's clothing, her usually perfect hair hidden under a worn hat. "Father's reviewing them now. He says it's enough to bring federal charges, but only if we can keep Luke alive long enough to testify." The 2 women regarded each other, one a judge's daughter who'd given up everything for principle, the other a widow who'd found purpose in justice. Different worlds, same courage. "They've got him in the old freight warehouse," Margaret continued. 20 men guarding it. Pike's not taking chances this time. Daniel checked his pistol, his face grim. "Then we need a distraction, something big enough to draw them off." "Already arranged," Father Miguel said, entering with several Mexican laborers. "Roberto Delgado and his friends have agreed to help. A fire in the lumber yard should bring everyone running." Eliza stood, her decision made. "I'll go for Luke." "Like hell," Daniel started, but she cut him off. "I know that warehouse. Delivered laundry there when I first came to town, back when they'd still hire a widow. There's a loading door in the back, warped wood. I can get through." They argued, but time was their enemy. "Finally," Daniel conceded, though his eyes promised he'd be close behind. As they prepared to leave, Margaret caught Eliza's arm. "He loves you. You know, Luke. He told me before I left for Santa Fe. Said meeting you made him see what kind of man he wanted to be." Eliza's throat tightened. "Let's make sure he lives to be that man." The streets of Coyote Bend were unusually quiet, as if the town itself held its breath. They split up Roberto's men heading for the lumber yard, Daniel taking position where he could cover the warehouse, Father Miguel returning to the church to prepare sanctuary if needed. Eliza made her way through back alleys, her dark shawl helping her blend with shadows. The warehouse loomed before her, lamplight showing through cracks in the walls. She could hear voices inside, rough laughter mixed with something darker anticipation of violence to come. She found the warped door, just as remembered. Years of desert heat and rare rains had twisted the wood, leaving a gap at the bottom just wide enough for a determined woman to squeeze through. She lay flat, pushing herself through inch by painful inch, splinters catching at her clothes. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of crates and shadows. She could see Luke near the center, tied to a post, his face bruised but defiant. Pike paced before him like a restless predator, while other men lounged nearby, passing a bottle and making crude jokes about the coming entertainment. "Should have stayed in Boston, boy," Pike was saying. "Could have lived soft, married that judge's daughter, never had to dirty your hands. But no, you had to develop a conscience." Luke raised his head, meeting Pike's gaze steadily. "Rather die with a conscience than live without one." Pike backhanded him casually, splitting his lip. "Oh, you'll die all right. But first, you're going to confess. Going to tell everyone how the Apache paid you to betray your own kind, how that Mexican deputy corrupted you, how the Heart Widow seduced you into treason." "Go to hell, Pike!" "Already been. Place called Chancellorsville. Watched better men than you die in the mud. Learned something there. Only thing that matters is surviving and taking what you can." A commotion outside interrupted him. Shouts of "Fire!" echoed through the night. Men rushed to the doors, craning to see the orange glow rising from the direction of the lumber yard. "Collins, Morrison, check it out." Pike ordered, "Rest of you stay put. Could be a trick." But more men slipped out, drawn by curiosity and the primal fear of fire in a wooden town. Soon, only Pike and 5 others remained. Still too many, but better odds than before. Eliza crept closer, using the crates for cover. She needed to get Luke free, but the ropes were in plain sight. Then she noticed something, a bucket of lamp oil near the wall, probably used to fill the lanterns. An idea formed, dangerous but possible. She made her way to the bucket, lifted it carefully, then, taking a deep breath, she stepped into the open. "Mr. Pike!" she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Every gun in the room swung toward her. Pike's eyes narrowed with recognition and something else, satisfaction. Well, the widow Hart, come to say goodbye to your lover." "I've come to make a deal," Eliza said, setting the bucket down slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Me for him, that's what you really want, isn't it? The woman who defied you, who made you look weak in front of the town?" Pike smiled, cold as winter moonlight. "You've got stones. Woman, I'll give you that." "Let him go," Eliza pressed. "You've got me. I'm the one who helped him escape, who took him to the Apache. He's just a fool who fell for a pretty face. But me, I chose to defy you. That's what really burns, isn't it?" She could see she'd hit a nerve. Pike's pride, always his weakness. He stepped closer, leaving Luke behind. "You think you're clever," he said softly. "Think you can manipulate me like you did him." "I think you're a small man who mistakes cruelty for strength," Eliza replied, matching his tone. "I think you're so eaten up with hate you can't see when you're being played." Pike's hand flashed out, gripping her throat. "Played by who?" "Dwyer," she gasped. "Check his telegrams. He's already made a deal with the federal marshals. You're the sacrifice, Pike, the one who takes the fall while he walks away clean." It was a lie, but plausible enough to make Pike hesitate, in that moment of uncertainty. Several things happened at once. Daniel burst through the front door, gun drawn. One of Pike's men spun to fire at him, and Eliza, with strength born of desperation, kicked over the bucket of lamp oil, sending it spreading across the wooden floor toward the nearest lantern. "Nobody move!" Daniel shouted, but chaos had already erupted. Eliza broke free from Pike's loosened grip, diving toward Luke. Her hands worked at the knots, made clumsy by urgency. Pike roared with rage, turning his gun toward her. The shot that saved her life came from an unexpected source. Tom Garrett, the rancher who'd questioned Pike at Box Canyon, stood in the doorway with a smoking rifle.
"That's enough. Clayton, it's over."
Behind him, more townspeople flooded in, men who'd ridden with Pike but had finally seen too much, understood too late what they'd been part of. Pike looked around wildly, seeing his support evaporate. With a snarl of pure hatred, he raised his gun toward Luke. "If I'm going down—" He never finished. Daniel's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Pike's gun discharged into the floor, igniting the spilled lamp oil. Flames raced across the wood, hungry and hot. "Everyone out," Daniel commanded. Eliza had Luke free now, supporting his weight as they stumbled toward the exit. The warehouse, full of dry goods and years of dust, caught fire with terrifying speed. They burst into the night air just as windows began exploding from the heat. In the street, half the town had gathered. The fire in the lumber yard, already controlled by Roberto's men who'd set it carefully, had drawn them out. Now they watched as Pike was dragged from the burning warehouse, clutching his wounded shoulder, his empire of fear collapsing around him. Judge Thornwood pushed through the crowd, several federal marshals beside him. "Clayton Pike, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and about 15 other charges I'll enjoy reading to you." As Pike was led away, spitting curses, Eliza held Luke upright, checking his injuries. His face was battered, but his eyes were clear, alive with something that might have been hope. "You came for me," he said wonderingly. "Did you doubt I would—" "Never," he admitted. "But I didn't want you to risk—" She silenced him with a kiss, there in front of the whole town. Let them gossip, let them judge. She was done living by their rules. When they parted, Daniel stood nearby, a slight smile on his dust-covered face. "Nice work with the oil, though next time, maybe warn me before you start a fire." "Next time," Eliza laughed, slightly hysterical with relief. "Let's hope there's never a next time." Margaret appeared at her father's side, her eyes finding Luke. There was a moment of awkwardness, the ghost of what might have been. Then she smiled, genuine and warm. "I'm glad you're safe," she told Luke. "Both of you." She looked at Eliza with respect. "Take care of him. He's stubborn, idealistic, and entirely too willing to get himself shot for his principles." "I've noticed," Eliza replied dryly. As the crowd began to disperse, fighting the warehouse fire before it could spread, Father Miguel approached. "The church is open if you need sanctuary," he offered, "though I think perhaps the danger has passed." Amos Calder's arrival caused another stir. The powerful rancher looked older, diminished somehow. As he approached his son, the crowd gave them space, sensing the private nature of what came next. "Luke," Amos began, then stopped, searching for words. I heard what happened, what Pike planned, what you tried to do." "I'm not apologizing for my choices," Luke said firmly, though Eliza could feel him trembling against her. "I'm not asking you to," Amos replied, surprising them both. "I'm asking you to forgive mine." The warehouse roof collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks, as if punctuating the end of an era. In the dancing firelight, Eliza saw the future stretching before them, difficult still, with prejudices to overcome and wounds to heal, but possible now in ways it hadn't been before. She thought of the documents safe with Judge Thornwood, of the federal investigation that would follow, of the chance for real justice. She thought of Luke beside her, choosing love over hate, courage over comfort. She thought of Daniel, who'd risked his badge and his life for what was right. Most of all, she thought of her late husband Thomas, and the promise she'd made at his grave to live fully, to choose hope over bitterness, to stand for those who couldn't stand alone. "Come on," she said softly, guiding Luke away from the burning building. "Let's get you somewhere safe. The real work starts tomorrow." As they walked through the streets of Coyote Bend, the widow and the rancher's son. They left behind more than a burning warehouse. They left behind the old rules, the old hates, the old limitations. And if the path ahead was uncertain, at least they would walk it together, hand in hand, into whatever dawn awaited. Storm clouds gathered over Box Canyon like a congregation of ravens, turning the noon sky dark as dusk. The first drops of rain hit the dust with tiny explosions, releasing the scent of creosote and sage. Thunder rolled across the desert, echoing off the canyon walls where 3 fugitives and their pursuers would soon converge for a final reckoning. Eliza guided her horse carefully down the treacherous path. Luke slumped against her. His breathing labored from their desperate flight. Behind them, Daniel kept watch, his Winchester ready. They could hear Pike's mob now, horses, dogs, men shouting to each other as they closed the distance. There, Daniel pointed to the narrow entrance of Box Canyon. Once we're inside, they'll have to come at us single file. But Eliza's heart sank as they entered. The wooden railway bridge spanning the canyon's far end groaned ominously in the rising wind. Dwyer's construction crews had built it as part of the planned route, a skeletal promise of the future they'd tried to force on the land. Now it stood as their only escape route, or their trap. "Can we cross?" Luke asked, raising his head with effort. Daniel studied the structure with a practiced eye. "Maybe, if we're lucky, if it holds." Thunder crashed directly overhead, and the skies opened. Rain fell in sheets, turning the canyon floor into a rushing stream within minutes. Desert floods came fast and deadly. Eliza knew they had little time. "Riders," Daniel shouted over the storm. Pike appeared at the canyon entrance, water streaming from his hat, his face twisted with fury. Behind him, his mob spread out, but the narrow opening prevented them from rushing in en masse. With them, Eliza noticed with a chill, was Harrison Dwyer himself, sitting his horse with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to rough riding. But there was another figure that made her blood run cold. Amos Calder, Luke's father, his face grim as granite. "It ends here," Pike shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Send out my men you ambushed, and maybe we'll make it quick." Daniel stepped forward, water running down his face. "Your men are safe. They're witnesses to the truth now. Pike, it's over." "Nothing's over till I say it is." Pike raised his rifle. That's when Amos Calder did something unexpected. He spurred his horse forward, putting himself between Pike and the fugitives. "Enough. Clayton, that's my son you're aiming at." "Your son's a traitor," Pike snarled. "You said so yourself." "I said a lot of things," Amos replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Believed a lot of lies, but a man can admit when he's wrong." Dwyer pushed forward, his thin face pinched with anger. "Mr. Calder, need I remind you of our agreement, the contracts you've signed? Contracts built on blood aren't worth the paper they're written on." Amos shot back. "I'm done with your schemes, Dwyer." The standoff stretched taut as wet leather. Then Luke struggled to his feet, Eliza supporting him. His voice, when it came, was strong despite his weakness. "Father, I have the documents, proof of everything, the false flag raids, the bribes, the plan to provoke a war, Dwyer and Pike. They've been playing us all." "Shut your mouth!" Pike swung his rifle toward Luke, but Amos's hand flashed to his holster. "I said enough?" The elder Calder's gun was out now, steady despite the rain. "You shoot my boy, Pike, and you'll be dead before he hits the ground." The mob behind them murmured uneasily. These men had followed Pike for pay and promises. But facing down Amos Calder, the man who'd carved an empire from this unforgiving land, was another matter entirely. Dwyer, perhaps sensing the shifting mood, tried another approach. "Gentlemen, please, we're all reasonable men here. Surely we can—" His words were cut off by a new sound, the rumble of water rushing down from the heights. Flash flood. The rain in the mountains was funneling down into the canyon, turning it into a death trap. "The bridge!" Eliza shouted. "We have to get to high ground." But Pike, consumed by rage and the collapse of his plans, made a fatal error. He fired not at Luke, but at the bridge supports, trying to trap them. The old wood, already weakened by rain and time, splintered under the impact. "No!" Daniel roared, but it was too late. The bridge groaned, tilted, but didn't fall yet. Beyond it, Eliza could see the flood coming, a wall of brown water carrying debris, dead trees, everything in its path. "Everyone out!" Amos commanded his men. "Now." Some listened, wheeling their horses toward the canyon entrance, but Pike and his most loyal followers pressed forward, determined to finish what they'd started. In the chaos, Dwyer tried to retreat but found his path blocked by the panicking mob. Eliza made a desperate decision. The bridge might hold one person's weight, maybe two. She pulled Luke toward it. "We have to try." But Luke pulled back. "You go take the documents." He pressed the oilcloth bundle into her hands. "Someone has to survive to tell the truth." "I'm not leaving you." Daniel was suddenly beside them. "Both of you, go, I'll hold them off." But there was no time for heroic sacrifices. The flood hit the canyon entrance with the force of a locomotive, sweeping men and horses before it. Screams were swallowed by the roar of water. Pike, standing in his stirrups to get a clear shot, was among the first taken, his final curse lost in the chaos. "The wall!" Amos was shouting, pointing to a series of handholds carved into the canyon wall, ancient steps used by indigenous peoples for generations. Climb. It was their only chance. Eliza went first, the document strapped to her body, Luke behind her, Daniel supporting him from below. The water rose with terrifying speed, lapping at their heels, then their waists. Amos Calder, the man who'd spent decades taking from this land, now used his knowledge of it to save others. He guided survivors to the handholds, even pulling Dwyer sobbing with terror to safety. Eliza's hands were raw, her muscles screaming, but she climbed behind her. She could hear Luke gasping with effort, Daniel encouraging him. The water rose higher, carrying away Pike's grand plans along with the man himself. They reached a ledge halfway up the canyon wall, barely large enough for their group. Survivors huddled together, former enemies united by disaster. Below them, the flood raged, reshaping the canyon floor, sweeping away the bridge entirely. Dwyer, pressed against the rock face, began to babble. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Just some relocated Indians, some bought-out farmers. Progress demands sacrifice. You have to understand. "Shut up," Amos said wearily. "Just shut up." They waited out the storm on that ledge, the longest hours of Eliza's life. She held Luke, feeling his heartbeat against her chest, proof that they'd survived. Daniel sat nearby, keeping watch even now, the lawman to the end. When dawn finally came, the flood had receded, leaving devastation in its wake. The canyon floor was transformed, littered with debris and the bodies of those who hadn't made it to high ground. Pike was gone, along with his dreams of empire built on violence. The survivors made their way down carefully. At the canyon mouth, they found federal marshals waiting. Judge Thornwood had made good on his promise, bringing real law to the territory. Dwyer was arrested immediately, his confession on the ledge witnessed by too many to deny. The documents Eliza had protected provided the rest. The railroad scheme collapsed, its executives soon facing prosecution. But the most profound moment came when Amos Calder approached his son. The old rancher looked haggard, aged by the night's revelations and violence. "Luke," he began, then stopped, struggling with words. "Your mother would have been proud of you, standing for what's right, even against me. I forgot who I was supposed to be. Let greed and fear turn me into something she wouldn't recognize." Luke, leaning heavily on Eliza, met his father's eyes. It's not too late to remember. Amos nodded slowly. No, maybe not. He looked at Eliza then, this widow who'd saved his son, who'd shown more courage than any of his hired guns. Miss Hart, I owe you more than I can repay. You owe me nothing, Eliza replied. But you owe them everything. She gestured toward the distance, where the Apache camps lay, and the Mexican families, and the small farmers, everyone your schemes would have destroyed. Yes, Amos agreed quietly. I do. As the sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls gold and red, the survivors began their journey back to Coyote Bend. Everything had changed in a single night. The old order, built on violence and exclusion, had been swept away like the bridge. What would replace it remained to be seen, but at least now there was hope for something better. Eliza walked beside Luke, supporting him still. They'd faced death together, chosen each other over safety, proven that love could bloom even in the harshest ground. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer impossible. Daniel walked on Luke's other side, badge still pinned to his chest despite everything. He'd upheld the law in its truest sense, not the letter that served the powerful, but the spirit that protected the weak. Behind them, Amos Calder rode slowly, lost in thought. The empire he'd built would survive, but transformed. His son had taught him that strength could mean building bridges instead of walls, that true power came from lifting others up rather than crushing them down. And in the archives of history, Harrison Dwyer would be remembered not as the visionary who brought progress to the frontier, but as a cautionary tale of what happened when ambition divorced itself from humanity. The storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean. In Box Canyon, new flowers would bloom from seeds long dormant, waiting for just such a flood to give them life. And in Coyote Bend, a new chapter was beginning, one written by ordinary people who'd found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. 2 days after the flood, the small church in Coyote Bend had been transformed into a makeshift courthouse. Pine benches creaked under the weight of an unprecedented gathering, Anglo ranchers beside Mexican farmers. Townspeople who'd never spoken now pressed shoulder to shoulder. And most remarkably, a delegation from the Apache band seated near the front, their presence protected by federal marshals. Judge Theodore Thornwood presided from behind a simple table that served as his bench, the American flag hanging behind him, still damp from the storm. The air smelled of wet wood and kerosene from the lamps needed to pierce the gray morning light filtering through narrow windows. Eliza sat in the witness chair, her hands folded calmly despite the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She'd traded her torn trail clothes for a simple black dress, her widow's garb, worn now not for mourning but as armor against those who would dismiss her testimony. Mrs. Hart, Judge Thornwood began, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. Please tell the court what you witnessed on the morning of September 8th. Eliza's voice was clear, each word dropping into the hushed room like stones into still water. She told of finding Luke wounded, of the documents he carried, of their flight into the desert. She spoke of Pike's pursuit, of the conspiracy to provoke war, of men who saw human lives as acceptable losses in their pursuit of profit. When she produced the oilcloth bundle, still stained with Luke's blood, a murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Thornwood's assistant carefully unpacked each document, reading key passages aloud. With each revelation forged military orders, plans to frame the Apache for attacks on settlers, lists of bribes paid to territorial officials. The murmur grew louder. Order, Judge Thornwood commanded, though his own face showed disgust at what was being revealed. From the defendant's table, Harrison Dwyer sat shackled. His Eastern sophistication crumbled like old parchment. Beside him, his lawyer, brought in from Santa Fe at considerable expense, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. These documents were obtained illegally, the lawyer protested. Stolen from private correspondence, documents detailing a criminal conspiracy have no protection under law. Judge Thornwood replied curtly, "Continue. Mrs. Hart." But before Eliza could speak again, a disturbance arose from the back of the church. "Mrs." Sarah Morrison pushed forward, her weathered face set with determination. Her husband had ridden with Pike, had been one of those lost in the flood. "I have something to say," she declared. Judge Thornwood frowned. "This is not a town meeting. Madam, there are procedures." "To hell with procedures," Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "My Jake's dead because of the lies, because men like him." She pointed at Dwyer, convinced folks that killing Indians and Mexicans was patriotic, that stealing land was progress. She pulled out a leather journal. "Jake couldn't read too good, but he could write some. Kept track of every raid Pike ordered, every time they dressed up like Apache to attack settlers. He was planning to quit, soon as he'd saved enough to get us away from here." Tears streamed down her face. He never got the chance. The judge accepted the journal, scanning its pages. His expression grew grimmer with each entry. "This corroborates Mrs. Hart's testimony. Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. Your husband's words may help prevent future tragedies." Next came testimonies from the Mexican families. Roberto Delgado speaking of mysterious fires that only struck those who refused to sell their land. Maria telling of threats made against anyone who aided the Apache bands. The old priest, Father Miguel, testified about confessions he'd heard not protected by sanctity when they involved ongoing crimes from men haunted by what Pike had made them do. Then Luke Calder took the stand, still pale from his ordeal but steady in his resolve. His father watched from the gallery, face unreadable as stone. "I was raised to hate," Luke said simply. "Taught that Apache were savages, that Mexicans were inferior, that taking what we wanted was our divine right as white Americans. But then I started seeing the cost families burned out, children orphaned, good land soaked in blood for no reason but greed." He looked directly at Dwyer. "You came to my father with promises of progress, of a new era, of prosperity. But prosperity for whom, built on whose graves?" "Young man," Dwyer's lawyer interrupted. "Weren't you shot while meeting with known hostile Indians? Doesn't that suggest you were engaged in treason?" Luke's laugh was bitter. "I was shot while trying to prevent a massacre you and Pike had planned. If preventing murder is treason, then I'm guilty." "Tell us about the meeting," Judge Thornwood instructed. Luke's testimony laid bare the full scope of the conspiracy, how Dwyer had recruited Pike, how they'd planned to provoke an Apache uprising that would justify military intervention, clearing the land for railroad expansion. The wounded man's words painted a picture of calculated evil dressed in the rhetoric of civilization. The most dramatic moment came when Joseph Crow Feather was called to testify. The Apache leader's presence in the witness chair sent whispers through the Anglo section of the gallery, but he spoke with quiet dignity through Maria Broken Wing, who translated. "We came to that meeting in peace," he said. "Luke Calder risked much to warn us. He spoke truth that men who claim to represent law plan murder. For this truth, he was shot by those same men." "And your people's response?" the judge asked. "We could have taken vengeance. Apache know how to fight, how to make the desert drink blood. But this woman," he gestured to Eliza, "and this man showed us another way. They proved some whites can choose justice over tribe, so we choose the same." Amos Calder's testimony shocked everyone. The powerful rancher took the stand like a man approaching the gallows, each step heavy with the weight of his choices. "I built my empire on fear," he said, his voice rough. "Convinced myself it was strength. When Dwyer came with his offers, I saw only profit. When Pike promised to handle problems, I didn't ask how." He looked at his son. "It took nearly losing Luke to see what I'd become, what I'd allowed in my name." From his coat, he produced more documents contracts he'd signed with Dwyer, correspondence about clearing certain parcels of land. "I'm guilty too," he said simply. "I don't ask for mercy, just the chance to make some measure of amends." The trial stretched through the day. Witness after witness building an undeniable case. Even some of Pike's surviving men testified, granted leniency in exchange for truth. The picture that emerged was of a frontier where law had been twisted to serve the powerful, where progress was a mask for theft, where civilization meant crushing anyone who stood in the way of profit. As shadows lengthened across the church floor, Judge Thornwood called for closing statements. Dwyer's lawyer made a valiant effort, arguing about the necessities of progress, the hostile nature of the frontier, the need for strong measures in lawless lands. But his words fell flat against the weight of evidence, the parade of victims, the documentation of deliberate evil. When time came for sentencing, the church fell silent. Judge Thornwood stood, his robes lending gravity to the moment. Harrison Dwyer, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, and incitement to violence. You came to this territory not to build but to steal, not to civilize but to corrupt. You perverted the promise of progress into a weapon against the innocent. He paused, letting his words sink in. However, this court also recognizes that you were enabled by a system that allowed such corruption to flourish. Therefore, while you will serve 20 years in federal prison, this court also orders a full investigation into territorial governance, railroad practices, and the treatment of indigenous peoples and Mexican citizens. Dwyer sagged in his chair, the reality of his fall complete, but Judge Thornwood wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court orders the establishment of a territorial commission with equal representation from Anglo, Mexican, and Apache communities to oversee land disputes and prevent future conspiracies. The railroad may come to this territory, but it will come lawfully, with fair compensation and respect for all who call this land home. The gallery erupted anger from some, joy from others, but mostly a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Justice, real justice, had come to Coyote Bend. As federal marshals led Dwyer away, Eliza felt Luke's hand find hers. They'd won more than a legal victory. They'd proven that courage could triumph over corruption, that love could bridge hatred, that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil and prevail. Outside the church, as people filed out into the cooling evening, an unusual sight greeted them. Apache warriors stood beside Mexican farmers and Anglo ranchers, not in confrontation but in wary acknowledgement of shared humanity. It wasn't peace, too much blood had been spilled for that, but it was a beginning. Maria Brokenwing approached Eliza as the crowd dispersed. "You carry strong medicine," she said in her accented English. "Not in herbs or potions, but in heart. This is good." Daniel Reyes, his badge now carrying federal authority as the judge had appointed him territorial marshal, stood watching the mingling crowds with satisfaction. "Never thought I'd see the day," he murmured to Eliza and Luke. "It's not over," Luke warned. "There'll be others like Dwyer, like Pike, men who see opportunity in division. Then we'll face them," Eliza said firmly. "Together." Amos Calder approached hesitantly, hat in hand. "Luke, Mrs. Hart, I've spoken with Joseph Crow Feather and the Mexican community leaders. We're going to meet weekly, work out fair agreements for water rights, grazing, trade. It won't undo the past, but maybe it's a start," Luke finished, extending his hand to his father. As night fell over Coyote Bend, the church bells rang not in alarm, but in celebration. For the first time in memory, they rang for all the town's people, regardless of origin or language or faith. It was a sound that would echo through the territory, a promise that justice delayed need not be justice denied. The trial was over, but the real work was just beginning. Building a community from the ashes of division would take years, maybe generations. But here in this moment, with former enemies standing as neighbors, with truth triumphant over lies, with love conquering fear, anything seemed possible. Eliza Hart, the widow who'd carried a wounded man through hostile streets, stood at the center of this transformation. She'd lost a husband to disease, nearly lost a new love to violence. but had gained something precious proof that one person's courage could inspire others, that choosing compassion over hate could change the course of history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Coyote Bend rested in the glow of justice served, its people united by the simple, radical notion that all human lives had value, that the desert bloomed most beautifully when watered by diverse hands working together. Spring came to the desert in whispers of green, painting the harsh landscape with unexpected gentleness. Patches of wildflowers bloomed where blood had been spilled, as if the earth itself was determined to transform tragedy into beauty. The morning air carried the scent of sage and new beginnings as Coyote Bend prepared for a wedding unlike any the town had ever seen. Eliza Hart stood before the cracked mirror in her small adobe home, running her fingers over the simple white dress Maria Delgado had helped her sew. It wasn't fancy, just clean cotton with a bit of lace at the collar, but it was hers, chosen not for show, but for the joy of the day ahead. "You look beautiful," Margaret Thornwood said from the doorway, having arrived to help with preparations. The judge's daughter had become an unexpected friend in the months since the trial, their shared courage creating a bond that transcended their different worlds. "I look like myself," Eliza replied with a smile. "That's all I want to be today." Through the window, she could see the preparations in the town square. Tables made from sawhorses and planks stretched beneath cottonwood trees, just beginning to show their leaves. Mexican women arranged wildflowers while Apache children played alongside Anglo youngsters, their laughter a sound that would have been impossible just months before. At the old mission church, Luke Calder adjusted his string tie for the 10th time, his hands betraying nerves that facing down gunmen hadn't caused. Daniel Reyes, serving as his best man, watched with amusement. "She said yes already," Daniel reminded him. "The hard part's over." "Is it?" Luke glanced toward where his father stood with Joseph Crowfeather. The two men engaged in what appeared to be civil conversation. 6 months ago, they would have killed each other on sight. Now they're discussing water rights and grazing rotations. "Things change," Daniel said simply, "when people decide to let them." The federal marshal's badge on Daniel's vest caught the light. His appointment had brought real law to the territory, the kind that protected all citizens regardless of their origins. It was a heavy responsibility, but one he carried with pride. Father Miguel appeared in the doorway. "It's time, my sons." The wedding ceremony was held outside, under the vast blue sky that was both witness and blessing. Eliza walked through the gathered crowd alone, needing no one to give her away. She was giving herself, freely and joyfully, to the man who'd helped her find purpose beyond grief. As she moved between the rows of guests, Eliza saw the miracle of their gathering. Sarah Morrison sat with other widows from Pike's mob, women who'd chosen forgiveness over bitterness. Roberto and Maria Delgado were there with their daughter Rosa, healthy now thanks to the medicine cooperative Eliza had helped establish. Apache families sat beside Mexican traders, Anglo ranchers beside former enemies, all bound by the simple act of witnessing love triumph over hate. Luke's face when he saw her was worth every hardship they'd endured. Gone was the arrogance of privilege, replaced by the quiet strength of a man who'd learned that true power came from protecting others, not dominating them. Father Miguel performed the ceremony in English, Spanish, and with phrases Maria Broken Wing had taught him in Apache, a linguistic tapestry that reflected their new community. When he asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence was profound. Even the desert wind stilled, as if nature itself blessed this joining. "I have something to say," Amos Calder announced suddenly, rising from his seat. A ripple of tension passed through the crowd, but the elder Calder's face was peaceful. "I object to having waited so long to say this. Luke, Eliza, you've taught an old man that it's never too late to change. Your love proved that courage is stronger than fear, that mercy is mightier than vengeance. I'm proud to call you both my family." His words broke something loose in the gathering. Applause started slowly, then swelled, mixing with tears and laughter, when Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, and Luke kissed Eliza with tender reverence. The cheer that went up could be heard clear to the mountains. The celebration that followed was like nothing Coyote Bend had experienced. Tables groaned under dishes from 3 cultures, Maria's tamales beside Sarah Morrison's cornbread, Apache fry bread next to German strudel from the Hoffmans who ran the general store. Musicians played, their fiddles and guitars and drums creating new rhythms from old traditions. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel stood to make a toast. The new federal marshal raised his glass of punch whiskey, having been banned from the celebration at Eliza's insistence. "To Luke and Eliza Calder," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "who showed us that the strongest bridges are built not from steel and wood, but from understanding and respect, who proved that love doesn't ask permission from prejudice, who reminded us that we're all just people trying to make our way in a hard land. And we do it better together than apart." The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, followed by others, some in Spanish, some in Apache, all speaking of hope for the future and gratitude for the courage that had brought them to this moment. As evening settled over the celebration, Eliza found a quiet moment with Luke on the wooden sidewalk outside the church. The stars were just beginning to show, diamonds against the darkening sky. "Any regrets?" Luke asked, taking her hand. "Only that Thomas couldn't see this." Eliza replied honestly, "He would have been so happy to know that his death led to life, that our loss led to so much gain for others." "He knows," Luke said with certainty. "Somehow, he knows." They were interrupted by young Rosa Delgado, who shyly offered Eliza a crown of desert flowers. "For the teacher," she said in careful English. "Thank you for saving me." Eliza knelt to embrace the child, remembering that desperate day when she'd brought medicine to a sick girl, setting in motion the events that had transformed their world. "We all saved each other, little one." As the evening progressed, stories were shared around the fires that had been lit against the desert chill. Joseph Crowfeather told of the old days, before the conflicts, when all peoples had traded freely. Amos Calder, humbled by experience, spoke of his late wife and her dreams of a peaceful valley. Even Sarah Morrison found her voice, sharing memories of her husband's better nature, the man he'd been before fear and lies twisted him. The new school building, constructed with funds from Amos Calder's restitution and labor from all 3 communities, stood at the edge of the square, its windows glowing with lantern light. Inside, Eliza had already begun teaching, her students a mix of Apache, Mexican, and Anglo children learning side by side. It was there she and Luke would make their home, in the teachers' quarters attached to the school, at the heart of the new Coyote Bend. As midnight approached and the celebration began to wind down, Eliza stood with Luke, watching their guests depart. Families who would have crossed streets to avoid each other now walked together, still wary, perhaps, but willing to try. It wasn't perfect. Perfection was too much to ask of people carrying generations of hurt, but it was real. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About that day," Eliza replied, "when I carried you through the streets, how everyone stared with such hatred, and now—" She gestured at the mingling crowd. "Now we're showing them another way." "Lean on me, you said." Luke murmured against her hair. Turns out we all needed someone to lean on. Daniel approached them one last time before departing. "I'm heading out at dawn," he said. "Reports of trouble near Silver Creek. Seems some folks didn't get the message about the new laws." "Be careful," Eliza said, embracing him briefly. "And remember, you always have a home here." Daniel's smile was bittersweet. "I know, and knowing that makes the riding easier." He shook Luke's hand firmly. "Take care of her." "With my life," Luke promised, as the last guests departed and the fires burned down to embers. Eliza and Luke stood alone in the square where their story had begun.
The same dust that had once carried whispers of hatred now settled peacefully in the starlight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled not a sound of loneliness, but of wild freedom, of nature enduring despite human folly. They walked hand in hand to their new home, past the spot where Eliza had collapsed under Luke's weight, past the jail where Daniel had made his choice, past the church where justice had finally been served. Each step was a small victory, each shared glance a promise of all the tomorrows to come. The desert night wrapped around them like a blessing, cool and vast and eternal. In the months and years ahead, there would be challenges, old prejudices died hard, and there would always be those who profited from division. But tonight, in this moment, love had won. Courage had triumphed. And in a small town on the edge of forever, people had chosen to build bridges instead of walls. Eliza Hart Calder, once a widow bearing a stranger's burden, now stood as wife, teacher, and symbol of what was possible when someone dared to say enough to hatred. The woman who'd urged a wounded man to lean on her had shown an entire community how to lean on each other. As they closed the door to their new home, the last sound that drifted through the night was that of children laughing in the distance. Apache, Mexican, and Anglo voices joined in play. It was the sound of the future, and it was beautiful. The desert stars wheeled overhead, ancient witnesses to this newest chapter in the human story. And in Coyote Bend, where the dust of old battles was finally settling, a new day was already waiting to dawn. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the Old West, where love conquered prejudice and courage changed the course of history. I'm curious, where are you listening to this story? Are you driving through your own desert landscapes, cozied up at home, or perhaps discovering these tales from somewhere across the ocean? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what touched your heart in Eliza and Luke's story, and where in the world their love reached you. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the horizon where justice and love meet under the endless western sky.